You're looking at a wreck that will probably only ever be dived once. When you get a single descent, really short bottom time and no second chances, you either learn how to interpret what you're seeing or you leave with unanswered questions. This video is about how I make sure every dive gives me usable answers rather than just vague impressions. What you're going to see during this video is the background footage, which is of an unknown wreck that I dived last year. You'll see my video, you'll see all the footage, and what I'm going to do at the end is I'm going to tell you what I observed on that wreck. So while you're listening to me, while you're watching this video, can I suggest that you make some mental notes or you write something down or whatever, and then at the end we'll compare notes and you can see if you saw the same things that I saw. So good luck with that. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because I get a lot of questions on my videos and on my posts asking how I go about identifying and navigating the wrecks of steamships, especially ones that I've never been on before. They're not just interested about how I enjoy diving them, but how I work out what I'm looking at when I arrive on an unfamiliar site. A wreck perhaps that I've never dived before, I've never seen before. Now, these questions usually come from the same place because at first glance, many steamship wrecks appear very, very similar. You drop onto a boiler, you drop onto an engine, you see collapsed plating and scattered structure, and it can all feel like an anonymous mass of metal. And for a lot of divers, that's kind of where the process stops. Of course, they enjoy the wreck visually. They enjoy the atmosphere. They notice bits and pieces. They might, like the fish, but the actual wreck remains unread. So they kind of experience it, but they don't really interpret it. So what I want to show you in this video is that this apparent chaos is misleading. Steamship wrecks were designed and built to a really clear logic, and that logic does still exist underwater. Once you understand how these ships were laid out and why they were built the way they were, a wreck can begin to make sense surprisingly quickly. All of a sudden, the structure starts to relate to function and stops just being random bits of metal. In this video, we're going to look how to identify and navigate steamship wrecks in a structured and repeatable way. It's not about instantly naming a wreck. It's not about those dramatic moments or lucky finds, although to be fair, they do sometimes happen. Instead, it's about following a clear process that allows you to gather useful information on every dive. Even when the visibility is poor, the conditions are demanding, or, as is normally the case for me, time on the bottom is really limited. Of course, on shallow wrecks, those that are close to shore, you may be fortunate enough to return multiple times. That means you can afford to miss details, you can afford to rethink what you've seen, and you can come back with a revised plan. Over several dives, understanding can build gradually, but that is rarely the case on the deep offshore wrecks that I normally dive. Most of the time, there's going to be a single descent, a single bottom phase, and one opportunity to notice what matters. There's no going back. You can't return the following weekend to check something that might have been overlooked. And that reality shapes how, I've got to approach observation, decision making underwater. That's why in this video, I'm going to focus on a structured framework for wreck identification, so that even a single dive produces clear and usable information rather than just confusion. For me, an entire identification process sits inside three simple stages. The pre-dive preparation, the observation during the dive, and then the structured analysis once you've got out of the water. If you follow those three stages consistently, your ability to interpret wrecks improves dramatically. More importantly, it becomes repeatable rather than simply relying on luck or memory. The first stage is the pre-dive phase, and this is where wreck identification actually begins. Before you even kit up, you should already be building a picture of what you expect to find. That means studying charts, hydrographic data, historical loss records, and online databases. It also means thinking about how you're going to record information underwater. So you might want to use a camera, video, or if you're old school, a slate. If you're ready to record what you see before the dive starts, you won't lose information that cannot be recreated afterwards. In the UK, we're particularly fortunate. The UK Hydrographic Office data is typically presented through wrecksite.eu and layered with multiple additional data sources. And these often provide basic dimensional information for charted wrecks, which usually includes length, orientation on the seabed, height above the seabed. Now, these details do not identify a wreck on their own, but what they do is they can be used to narrow the problem and shape your expectations. In practice, length is usually more important than beam. Many wrecks collapse outwards as they break up, which can make them appear much wider on the seabed than they ever were in service. Length, on the other hand, rarely changes unless the wreck has broken into two distinct sections, which is normally pretty obvious from the hydrographic data. The UKHO information will often also indicate the highest point on the wreck above the seabed. On steamships, that high point is normally the engine or the boiler, but might be the bow or the stern. And in many cases, the data will also show whether that high point sits amidships or close to the stern. That alone can often tell you whether you're dealing with a vessel that has the engine midships or an engine probably before you even enter the water. It's charted as being roughly 90 metres long. You can immediately rule out a large number of possible losses. When you then confirm that length on the dive, you're able to move, pretty quickly from speculation to a process of verification. Planning also shapes how you approach the descent. Knowing where the high point is helps you anticipate where the shot is likely to land and what you're likely to see first. The second stage is what happens during the dive itself, and obviously this is the most important phase. And it's where a deliberate and disciplined observation process matters the most. The first priority during the dive is orientation. As soon as you get to the wreck, you need to establish where you are in relation to the ship. That means identifying whether you're at the bow, the stern, or most likely somewhere in the middle, and then understanding which direction the vessel is pointing. Boilers are always positioned forward of the engine. If you move from a boiler towards the engine, you are moving towards the stern, and vice versa. Anchor chain and anchors themselves usually indicate the bow, although it's worth remembering that spare anchors were sometimes carried elsewhere on the vessel. They're strong indicators, but not absolute proof. In vessels with riveted hulls, where the plating overlaps, can also help. The overlap faces aft, So by following the direction of the plate, you can often tell which way the ship was originally pointing. Other useful features include drive shafts and screws. The drive shaft will run from the engine towards the screw, and these are often exposed as the surrounding structure collapses. Clearly, they provide a really good indication of the direction of the stern. And if you get there and find the screw, then you're absolutely sorted. Armament is another useful orientation clue. On merchant ships fitted with defensive weapons during wartime, the guns were almost always mounted at the stern, and that was part of what made them defensively armed ships rather than offensively armed ships. They were there to defend against submarine attack, or at least deter the submarine from trying to get close enough to use its own gun. Finding those gun mountings or the ammunition close to a machinery space or the screw will often suggest you're at the stern. Now, naval vessels also carry armament, but it's likely to be along the full length of the ship. So you just need to be careful with weapon placement. You need to think about what type of vessel believe you are diving. It's much more difficult on very large wrecks, those that are heavily broken, or wrecks that are partially buried, where the key reference features may be missing or just completely hidden under the sand. Standard orientation, the next step is to locate and assess the propulsion system. You might already have done that, but it means finding the engine and boilers and understanding how they relate to each other and how they relate to the ship. You need to determine whether the ship used some form of steam engine, a turbine installation, sails, or some other sort of propulsion system. Even with steam propulsion, the details matter. In fact, they matter a lot. Early steamships often used simple or compound engines, while later vessels tended to use triple expansion engines. More exotic engine arrangements may also appear, including diesel engines, four-cylinder engines, turbines, and I've even seen a steeple engine, which is where the pistons sit on top of each other. If you encounter something like this, it can dramatically narrow the field of possible ships very quickly. So you need to look at the size, the layout, and the cylinder arrangement of the engine, because those can be compared to information recorded in Lloyd's registers about individual ships. Because not many people know that engines were built specifically for individual ships, which means that they're basically fingerprints. If you measure the cylinder diameters, the number of cylinders, you can take those to the Lloyd register and they will individually identify a vessel. Boilers provide quicker but not quite as precise clues about a ship's size and age. The number of boilers can be used to give you a rough sense of scale. As a very general guide, a single boiler often indicates a ship that is about 1,000 tons or less. 2 boilers indicate a bigger vessel that's likely to be under about 2,000 tons. If you get to 3 boilers, then those are associated with bigger ships approaching 3,000 tons. If you find more than 3 boilers, chances are you're on a liner or a military vessel, which is absolutely brilliant. Now, these aren't precise rules, but they do provide a useful starting point. One thing to kind of be careful of are donkey boilers. These are smaller auxiliary boilers which were used to power deck machinery when the ship was in port, and they're often found very close to the engine, either alongside or often even vertically. Mistaking a donkey boiler for a main engine can easily lead to overestimating the size of the vessel. It's also worth considering boiler design because this does matter. Fired tube boilers are typically found in merchant steamships and tend to be large and cylindrical. Water tube boilers, such as those in Yarrow boilers, are usually smaller and more complex in structure. They were commonly used in naval vessels because they could generate steam far more quickly and operate at higher pressures. If you find a Yarrow or similar water tube boiler, it normally suggests you're either diving a military vessel or a ship built to military specifications rather than a conventional merchant steamer. To more modern vessels, additional clues begin to appear. You might get electrical cabling, which is increasingly common and immediately suggests a later build period, almost certainly after the First World War. Build quality is another revealing thing. Higher value ships often carried brass or bronze fittings. They had better quality bridge equipment and generally more refined construction. Cheaper ships were frequently built to really strict cost regime, which meant that the fittings might be made of iron and the construction simpler. So once you've had a look at these kind of features, and particularly the propulsion and boiler, the next step is to understand the overall layout of the wreck. That means identifying where holds are located, if there's deck heights, and general arrangement of the superstructure. And the reason is that these features are often consistent across particular ship types, but also can be used to quickly narrow down identification options. Another good thing to look at is cargo and artefacts. Cargo is normally treated as strong supporting evidence rather than actual proof of identity. Be careful of coal because it's really common and rarely identifies a specific vessel on its own, because obviously pretty much every ship carried it for the boilers and to generate power. More unusual cargo such as ingots, shells, railway equipment or manufactured goods can be really helpful. Now, artefacts are something that I'm sure you've seen on many of my videos, and the reason is because they are particularly important. Things like crockery fragments, bottles, equipment markings, these can sometimes identify a shipping line or give you a very precise date range. There are also occasional major artefacts that can produce genuine breakthroughs. The classic one is ship's bells, but you've also got builder's plates and certain bridge instruments which can sometimes provide direct identification. The reason I say that is bridge equipment was often fitted with serial numbers that can be checked against manufacturer records if you can get access to them. And in a lot of cases, those can point directly to a specific vessel. And I have personally identified vessels using numbers that have come off bridge equipment. And also provide useful identification clues. The caliber of a gun, the size of associated ammunition can sometimes help determine whether a weapon was fitted to a merchant ship for defensive purposes or was part of a naval vessel's primary armament. So if you see those kind of things, look at them. You'd be surprised how well recorded the armament that was fitted to merchant ships was. Once again, a really important clue. The final step during the dive is to look for unusual features such as damage. That might include torpedo strikes, mine damage, collision scars, or structural collapse patterns. Sometimes you can match those to historical accounts of a vessel's loss. Now, recognising what is unusual often comes down to experience. The more wrecks you dive and the more ship structures you become familiar with, the easier it becomes to realise that something doesn't fit the normal pattern. The final stage is going to take place after the dive. And this is where those raw observations are turned into identification evidence. What you need to do is discuss the dive with the other people who are on it, with your teammates. You need to go back and have a look at those photographs and video and compare them against all the information that you found on the pre-dive. So against those historical records, the hydrographic information, and all that kind of stuff. Once you've done it, I think it's really important to record your findings. Even if the information you record does not immediately identify the wreck, it contributes to the wider knowledge pool. Somebody else might go back and your confirmation of something like number of boilers, position of machinery, layout, cargo, that piece of crockery you found may allow someone else to complete the identification. Now, for me, wrecksite.eu is the preferred repository for storing that information. Because it's public source, it allows your data to be shared and built on over the time. Because wreck identification is often a collective process. You might not be the person who joins the final dots, but some of the stuff you contribute may become the missing piece for somebody else. There are loads of wrecks around the British Isles that are charted but remain unnamed. That doesn't make them unsolvable mysteries. It usually means that the available information has not yet been brought together or found. By sticking together all that stuff, the hydrographic data, the information about wreck losses, the stuff that divers find, you can often reduce a long list of possibilities to a manageable shortlist before you enter the water or once you've got up. A good example of this process in action is my identification of the steamship SS Nantes. The wreck wasn't identified by a single dramatic discovery. It actually was a putting together of individual bits and pieces. To start with, crockery recovered from the wreck carried the Cunard logo, which immediately told us who operated the vessel. Checking the loss records showed only a small number of Cunard ships lost in that area. One of those matched the recorded length on the hydrographic data. The loss location was also very close to the position, and once we got on the wreck, the engine and boiler arrangements and the presence of coal in the hold were all tied up with what we knew about the wreck from the historical records. Now, in themselves, none of these individual pieces would have been enough on their own to identify the wreck, but together they created a consistent and defensible identification of the ship. Now, that was a good story, but sometimes, even after careful analysis, the answer remains uncertain. That's not failure. It simply reflects the limit of the available evidence. Now, the wreck that you've been watching me diving is a really good example of this. It's really heavily broken at the bow. There's a pile of anchor chain, not much else. You probably saw that we landed on the stern, which is the highest bit. It's also where the engine, single boiler, and donkey boiler were located. You probably saw the screw during that as well. You saw those bits of crockery we found there. None of them had any useful logos on. You've also seen the two-cylinder engine. It's a compound engine, so high pressure and low pressure cylinder, but nothing there other than that to give any evidence. That It was probably carrying coal, maybe. There's some coal on the seabed. Whether there's enough to say it was the cargo is not really certain. It's scattered all over the seabed, so it may have just been moved away by the natural movement of water and time. The ship is clearly old, so in my head it's early 20th century, but we didn't really find anything to prove that. And it's about 70 meters long, which we had from the hydrographic data. So there's a whole load of ships that match that description that were lost, not just in this area, but in the wider surrounding area. No artifact. We didn't find a bell. We didn't find a maker's plate. As I said, none of the crockery had anything on it. So despite our best efforts, this ship is going to remain unknown. And because of where it is, it's really difficult. It's a long way out. Obviously, you've seen the depth on it. It's 90 meters, which means that almost certainly nobody is going to dive it again anytime soon. But the information is on WreckSite. If they want to go back, they will see what we've done. So that does happen. It happens quite a lot, more often than I'd like, really. But I think the important thing to take away from this is that by and large, steamship wrecks do reward disciplined, methodical observation. If you rush the dive, if you rush through them, the bits of it will blur together. But if you follow a structured process, I think they do become readable and coherent. You don't necessarily need to name the wreck immediately. For me, I think what matters is that every dive leaves you with a clearer understanding of the last. Of course, if you name it, that's brilliant. And the best way to do that, in my view, is to learn that framework that I suggested and apply it consistently. Do that, and the next time you descend onto a boiler or an engine or a pile of plates, you're not just looking at a wreck. You're going to be studying a ship. And if you want to see a load of examples of dives where I followed this process and I've done that, I'm going to put a link up above me, somewhere up here maybe, where you will see wrecks that I've been on, where I've managed to identify them. And that shows that the process, I think, does work. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you'll use my process. As always, if you've got comments or observations, stick them in the comment section. If you could give us a like, that would be brilliant. If you watch another one of my videos, that would be even better. But for now, I'm Dom Robinson, Deep Wreck Diver. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you on the next one.